Today's shiur begins 14 lines from the top of Daf Samach Bov. We open with a quote from the Mishnah. Boishasa ufigama. The Mishnah had mentioned that if the woman is embarrassed or experiences depreciation, which can certainly be understood in the case of her experiencing some type of impact initiated by some malicious human being, payment made is to her. The opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira in the Mishnah was to make a distinction whether it's an external type depreciation, an embarrassment, or something that's not such. We now turn to the topic heading that we have on the side of the Gemara. You'll notice that we have a nosei, which is the topic, and mivneh, a structural note, combined into one note, and a geometric form, a trapezoid, appears. These are she'elois sheyesh lishoil lefi ha'ikoroin shel Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, questions that one should ask according to the ikoron, according to the principle of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, sheyesh matzavim, that there are situations shetashlum al boishes ha'isha shulam lebaila, that there are boshes payments, embarrassment payments that are made to the woman's husband. Ma'ye hadin im, etc. What will the halacha be if the following? So as we go through the Gemara, you'll see a few of these questions that are raised. The Gemara, we open with a long question. You'll notice on the second line already of this long question, there's a bracketed section. The reason for these brackets is that the question that's raised within them isn't a real question. You'll see the Gemara rejects it as even a question to ask. But following that, you'll have a couple of questions that have to be dealt with. So now the Gemara. Maskif lo Rava bar Rav Chonon. Based on Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira's idea that if the woman is embarrassed, the payment goes in part to the husband, so that you can have a situation where A is embarrassed and B is getting the payment, getting part of the payment. So with that in mind, he asks, we're going to continue reading straight through because we already introduced that this isn't a serious question, but Ela Me'ata, if that be true, the principle that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira told us, Biyesh susasai shel chavero. If a person embarrasses someone else's horse, Hachi nami deboy lemitan lei boshes, are you going to say that the owner is going to get payment for that? So the Gemara says, what kind of question is that? V'sus bar boshes, is a horse something that lends itself, that's capable of being embarrassed? Obviously not. We're talking about compensation for having caused embarrassment. So you have to cause embarrassment. A horse doesn't experience that. Ella, rather the question is, Rokak bevigdoi shel chavero. If someone spit on someone else's clothing, Hachi nami deboi lemitan le boshes, would the offender have to pay for embarrassment? V'chitema hachi nami, and if you say that's right, you have to pay for spitting on someone else's clothing. So there is a payment to be made. But we see from the following source that that's not true. V'atanan, have we not learned Rokak v'gia boy haroik? If someone spit and the spit reached the person himself, we'll see the person's flesh himself. Upora rosh isha, someone uncovered a woman's hair. V'hevir talisoi mimenu, or someone threw off someone else's clothing. Chayav litein loy arba mea zuz. There's a 400 zuz payment that must be made. The Omar Rav Papa lo shanu ela boy, and Rav Papa emphasizes that in this the case of the spitting, it's only where the spit hits the person himself. Avol bevigdo potter, but if the spit hits the person's clothing, so he is exempt. So that you see from this question that the boshes payment is made only when the embarrassment is a result of something that's of a direct bodily nature. So much so that if the spit doesn't touch the victim's body, but rather his clothing, that's not sufficient grounds for imposing payment. If that's the case, why should a husband receive payment for his wife experiencing embarrassment? The Gemara answers, Bevigdo les lei zilusa. With regard to spit touching one's clothing, that does not result in a person's degradation. Ishto is lei or law zilusa. There is an alternative gears on the side, an alternative text that reads this islay, that when one's wife is subjected to embarrassment, that's a degradation to the husband. So as a result of that, the case of one's wife being embarrassed is a greater reason for payment to be made than spit reaching one's own clothing. There's a very deep message that I think that this Gemara is communicating, but we'll leave that for each one of you to decipher. The Gemara asks, again, we have a question. Omar le Ravina le Ravashi. Elo me'ato b'esh ani ben tovim. According to this idea of when there is zilusa, when there's a cheapening of an individual, so that even if it's not the actual individual, but it's someone who's so closely related that the second party also experiences this degradation. Imagine the following: someone embarrasses b'yesh oni ben tovim. Expression oni ben tovim you see from time to time, but it's someone embarrassed a poor man of standing. De'is le zilusa lekulu b'nei mishpacha. When that happens, the entire family is offended, is degraded. Are you going to say that everyone of his immediate family is to benefit, receive payment because their family member was embarrassed? And Tosfos elaborates a little bit. Rashi is quite silent on this, but Tosfos adds a little more understanding to this. Under the Gemara text in the widest lines, you can see there's a Tosfos on the sixth of those widest lines. Oni ben tovim d'islei zilusa l'chol b'nei mishpacha she'aleim l'shomer min hamakim oisai. The family members are there to protect him from those that might hit him, and therefore they're all in this together. So that if they're there to protect, as Tosfos says, their family member. Avol oshir ben tovim she'ein aleihim lishmor oisai ein misbaishin olav b'nei mishpacha. A man of wealth, where there isn't so much, we'll say, family responsibility of one to the other. If a man is a man of wealth, he has other means of protecting himself other than reliance upon his immediate family. There, if the question isn't even raised. But here, since they're all in it together, so maybe payment should be made to each one of them. The Gemara answers, whereas Rav Ashi responds, Hosam Amalei. Rav Ashi says, Hosam Lav Gufayu. There, it's not their bodies. Hacha Ishto Gufei Havoi. Here, one's wife is considered like his own body. Now, you can see this concept of Ishto Kigufo is not just we'll call it an allegory or a midrashic type concept, but it has actual monetary ramifications. So that one's physical closeness to one's wife, in fact, the Torah, in describing marriage in the very opening parts of the Torah that deal with creation of man and woman, it says, Al ken yazov ish es ovu ves imo v'dovak beishto v'hoyu lebosar echad. And the man clinging unto his wife, joining together, their bosar echad, become like one flesh. So you can see that this, as we just said a moment ago, has actual practical ramifications, making the embarrassment, the physical embarrassment that one's wife experienced, like the husband's own embarrassment. Now we come to a Mishnah that I have to tell you ahead of time is we'll say, fraught with what will appear to be redundancies. In fact, the next Mishnah, which you'll see at the top of the upper part of Amud Beis, rather close to the top of Amud Beis, has an opening line that would be, in a sense, a direct continuation of this particular Mishnah. There's very little Gemara commentary on this Mishnah. So it's upon us to try to understand the Mishnah as we learn the Mishnah itself, and then we'll approach the understanding of the seeming redundancies through a rather terse piece of Gemara, along with the Tosfos commentary for a more simple approach. The general topic has to do with that which we can actually glance at the side of the Gemara to read our own topic heading. Kama Kesubos b'Ksuba. How much does one write into the Ksuba document? The Ksuba document is that document which is basically a marital financial guarantee for the woman, that if she were to get divorced or become a widow, she would be able to claim the amounts that are written into this document. So we want to know how much will one write in actuality in Paska Lahavi if a decision was made on the part of her family, we'll see later also on the part of her husband, to bring in Kesef Mezuman, cash. Cash that's brought into a marriage, we'll see, is something that the husband will be able to take and profit with. Will be able to profit with it immediately. So that's one question. How much? And so everyone's probably thinking, well, if you bring in cash, you write in the amount that he brought in. But we're going to see not so. Number 2, chafotzim sheshomim oisam. Call that a shuma. Shomim is shuma. Chafotzim are articles that are brought into the marriage that undergo evaluation or assessment. So once again, you're going to ask, well, if it's assessed, so write in the amount. We're going to discover, though, when learning the Mishnah along with Rashi, that the assessment made there is an assessment made by members of the family, and family members will tend to inflate the actual value. And there's in fact a certain rate that people inflate, and you ask, why do people do that? Well, it's to create a feeling of greater significance in terms of the couple is getting married and bringing into the marriage all the more wealth. But when it comes to the husband's actual obligations to the wife upon divorce or her becoming a widow, so we're interested in a more accurate amount to be recorded. So now we turn to the Mishnah. Hapoisek mois lechasano umeis chasano. A father-in-law accepts upon himself a certain amount to write, to give over to his son-in-law, but before the marriage takes place, the son-in-law dies. And as a result of the death, the almona is going to be subjected to yibum, assuming that he leaves a brother. So she then falls to yibum. And the yavam comes to the father-in-law and says, you agreed to give such and such amount to my brother, I want that. Amru chachamim, yachol hu sheyoymar, the father can say, Lachicha yisi roitze litein, ulecha iyavshi litein. I was willing to give the money toward the marriage of my daughter with your brother, but to you, not so. Rashi adds a little more on this. Yochol, we're looking at Rashi, you'll see in the middle of the page. Yochol hu shoyoymar, the father can say, oh chalotzo yibeim, either release her or marry her. Avol ochiv, the deceased, when it comes to the father, the father has very little option. Once he agreed to give that amount of money, the brother could have said, "Oh yitain, either you pay that which you agreed, oh teshev ad sheyal bin rosha," or she'll just sit she'll sit until the hair of her head turns white. In other words, if you don't pay, I'm not taking her in. That approach, though, we see would not be the same with the case of the yavam. The yavam is subjected to this other alternative: either you release her or marry her. We turn back to the Mishnah. Posko lahachnis loy 1,000 dinar. An agreement was made that she will bring into the marriage 1,000 dinar, 1,000 dinar of cash. Hu posek kenegdon chamesh esrei mona. He will write into the ksuba as if he received 1,500 dinar. That's 15 mona is 1,500 dinar. That's one type of item or thing brought into the marriage, namely cash. In contrast, there is something called shum, and that's case number 2. Keneged shum hu posek pochois chomesh. If something is brought into the marriage, an item, an article, as opposed to cash, that is subjected to assessment, shum is assessment, so whatever they assess its value at, he will write in a fifth less, so that if some type of article or vessel is going to be brought into the marriage, and the family that's gathered together at the wedding says, "Oh, that washing machine is worth $1,000," so the husband will write into the ksuba that I received a washing machine worth $800. 800 being a fifth less than 1,000. Before we go any further, let us just point out that when it comes to the cash brought in, he's going to up it, the amount that is written into the ksuba, by when you look at the new number, it's by 1/3 of the amount that was originally brought in. So when the new amount, in other words, you'll take the original amount of cash, split it in half, as we have over here. 1,000 dinar are brought into the marriage. Half of 1,000 is 500, and you add that to the actual amount, you get 1,500. So the 1,500 is increased by what was it represents an increase of 1/3 of this number that's now being recorded. The reason for that is that when one receives cash, as we said before, he can profit with it immediately. As Rashi says, "Lefisha mistakir behen," since he's able to profit with it, it has this increased value to the husband. The fact that he's now receiving cash upon the marriage. And we said this is all in contrast to vessels and articles that she brings in that are subjected to evaluation. There, the husband will write into the ksuba an amount that represents 20% less than that which they had evaluated it at. And the Rashi points out that the reason for this is because those that are participant at the wedding and look at the items that she's bringing to the marriage, the custom was to evaluate them as a sign of honor to the kala at more than the actual value. And it's quite interesting here how psychology is so powerful when the fact that they're talking about it increases the kavod, the respect that the kala will appear with, more respect, and increase the affinity of the husband toward her, all at the same time that where there's an awareness that he's going to be recording less than that actual value. Very interesting idea on the psychological level. Another situation, shum b'mona v'shav b'mona. This is an item that's been evaluated, but not by the participants at the wedding, but rather market assessors evaluated the item. In other words, they'd have no purpose in raising the value from the actual market value of the item. So if something was evaluated as being worth a mona, and that's its market value, ein loy ella mona. So then the amount recorded as to the value of the item brought in will be exactly that. As the Mishnah goes on, you'll see, if you were to follow Rashi's commentary, you'll notice that these are examples of what we saw in number 2. In other words, the idea of reducing something by a fifth. The reduction from the amount that they assess it as, how much is actually to be written in. We said a fifth less. And here we have examples, and that's why we've indicated in our Mark Gemaras, you see the double underline appears as highlighting these examples. And we also wrote in Dugmoi Shel Din number 2. These are examples to illustrate Din number 2, because Din number 3 was fairly straightforward. Namely, if the market assessors assess it at a particular value, and the example the Mishnah gave was at a mona, that's how much the husband will write into the ksuba, indicating that that's the amount that she brought into the marriage. However, examples of case 2, shum b'mona, if something was evaluated as a 100, how much must the actual item be? He nosenes shloishim ve'echad sela v'dinar. A mona represents, we mentioned 100 dinar, it's also the equivalent of 25 zuz. Let me correct myself, 25 sela. So 1 mona is 100 dinar. It's the same thing as saying 25 sela. So if there is a situation of the husband being told right into the ksuba an item worth 100 dinar. If we look in the Rashi, the second line under the Gemara text, shum b'mona, he noisenes shloishim ve'echad sela v'dinar. Shum shehu mekabloi b'mona. She'amru lo, they told the chosan, ksoiv mona b'ksuba. V'tachnis loch shum shel mona. You write into the ksuba that you received 100. So the husband will be writing in 100 dinar, which is also the same as 25 sela. And they tell him she'll be bringing into the marriage shum shalmona, something that's worth 100. When it comes to the actual time of evaluation, tzorich sheyashumu oiseh bevayis shel chatuna shloishim ve'echad sela v'dina davei mona v'choim shai. So once again, if the family is telling him to write in to the ksuba that you received an article worth 100, when 100 dinar, which is 25 sela, and he'll write that in, it better be that when that item is presented at the wedding festivity, and the family is gathered together, and they evaluate it, we'll say their verbal evaluation had better be 31 and a quarter. That's 31 selah, and a quarter of a selah is a dinar. What is the significance of that number? So if you take 31 and a quarter and subtract 20% of that, you will get 25 selah. Another example of the same thing. Another example, uba arba meis, if they tell, her family members tell the chosan right into the ksuba that you received something worth 400. He nosenes chomesh meos. The item that she brings into the marriage, concerning which she wrote 400, they had better evaluate it at the family wedding festival, and the number that they say verbally should be 500. Once again, if you take a fifth off of 500, a fifth of 500 is 100, that comes out to 400. So that these two examples that we call examples of halacha number 2, these aleph and beis, these two double underlined examples, are illustrations of what we mean that keneged the shum, in the face of the family evaluation, he will write in an amount equaling a fifth less. So that if they're telling him, if they're instructing him, write in these amounts, when it comes to the verbal assessment at the wedding with all her family gathered together, they had better say amounts that are 25% more than the original sum that he wrote into the ksuba. I say 25% more than the original sum. That is the same as saying that the amount he wrote in is 20% less than the new sum, the evaluation amount that they stated. As you can see, the Mishnah gave us two examples of basically the same thing. That's an example of redundancy. Why do we need two examples? Furthermore, the Mishnah goes on, Ma shechosan, we're at the top of Omid Beis. By the way, there's another girsa. Instead of reading Ma shechosan, you see Rashi and Tosfos have the girsa ukeshachosan posek, and likewise when the chosan, he brings things into the marriage, the same principle applies. That things that the chosan, the husband, brings into the marriage that is subject to evaluation. Who posek pochos chomesh? When it comes to writing into the ksuba, he'll write in a fifth less than the verbal assessment that had been assigned to it. Now, as the Gemara opens up, it relates first to the first part of the Mishnah, as is standard procedure in Gemaras, that follow the order of the Mishnah in its explanation. So regarding the case of the Yavam, Tonu Rabbanon, Ein Sorach Lomar, it need not be taught Rishon Talmud Chacham Visheni Amoritz, where the deceased, the son-in-law, the original son-in-law died. He's the Rishon. He was a Torah scholar, and the second one, an Amoritz, an ignoramus, was a reasonable father-in-law would prefer a son-in-law that's a Torah scholar than one who is an Amoritz. So it goes without saying that in a case where the Yavam is an ignoramus, that the father-in-law would be able to say, I was willing to give the dowry, the amounts discussed to your brother, but to you, no. Elo afilu Rishon Amoritz v'sheni Talmud Chacham. The chiddush here is that even if the deceased was an ignoramus, and the Yavam himself is a Torah scholar, Yochol Lomar, the father-in-law can say, Lachicha yisirotze litain, to your brother, I had agreed to give, I was willing to give L'cha efshi lite, but to you, I can't give, I don't want to give. Poska lehachnis loy 1,000 dinar, and v'chulei indicates that the continuation of the Mishnah is what we're interested in. The Mishnah spoke in halacha number 2 of Kineged Hashum, when it comes to things that are evaluated, so less is written in. And then the Mishnah went on, the section that we had labeled as examples of number 2, it went on to give us examples of Shum, B'mona, Hi, No Senes, Shloshim V'Chotzela, etc. The Gemara says, Hainu Reisha, is it not so that the continuation of the Mishnah, in effect, is simply a reflection of the Reisha? The Reisha said already that when something's evaluated, so you write, when it comes to the writing into the text of the Ksuba, you write in a fifth less. So, hasn't that already been taught? What do I need the continuation of the Mishnah for? And this issue of continuation, it really affects the entire Mishnah. We saw even to the top line over here on this Omid, all that it's all redundancy. So the Gemara answers, Tana Shuma Rabba v'Kotani Shuma Zuta. Tana Shuma Didei v'Kotani Shuma Dida. The Mishnah feels the Mishnah needs to state this halacha with regard to large amounts and small amounts, regarding things she brings into the wedding, large and small, regarding things he brings into the marriage, large and small. We take a look at the Tosfos, who breaks down the Mishnah very methodically. We're looking at the Tosfos, the second Tosfos on the page, Tana Shuma Rabba v'Shuma Zuta. And as far as our Gemara markings presentations, we're going to be learning only the first part of this Tosfos, the first third of the Tosfos. The second part of the Tosfos, you'll see Uluri Nira, maybe you see that we've marked that off with a squiggle underline. There he gives a different approach. The Tosfos begins, Tana Shuma Rabba v'Shuma Zuta. Shuma Rabba, Hahu de Keneged Hashum U Poisek. What we have in our Mishnah as section 2, number 2 of the Mishnah, that phrase, Dekoya 1,000 dinar, that's a reflection of it's a continuation in terms of numbers of example 1. And example 1, there was 1,000 dinar of cash brought in. Example 2 has to do with something that's evaluated to the tune of 1,000 dinar. That's a large amount. That's a large assessment. An item that's worth a lot being assessed to that amount. V'shuma zuta, hainu seifa. The kshechosan poisek, the end of the Mishnah that spoke about when the chosan writes something in, when the chosan evaluates, that is a reflection of something small. The mashma psika koldehu, the language indicates whatever amount. Ubedida nami tana shuma rabba v'shuma zuta. So as far as the first part of Tosfos, he is telling us that that example number 2 of the Mishnah and the closing remark of the Mishnah are referring to the chosan bringing things into the marriage. Whether if the chosan brings something that's going to be that's an expensive type item that undergoes assessment, or the chosan brings in something of little cost that is subject to assessment. So structurally, the beginning and end of the issue of Shuma is a reference to the chosan's items that he's bringing in that will be subject to assessment. Tosfos goes on, Ubedidah Nami Tana Shuma Rabba V'Shuma Zuta, and focusing on the girl, the wife, that she brings into the marriage. Also, Zuta, the example of something small, was he noisenes shloishim ve'echad. That was the example that we saw 3 lines from the bottom of Amud Aleph, the first double underlined case of Shum b'mona hi noisenes shloishim ve'echad sela. The echad, that is a rabba, a shuma rabba, is hi nosenes chomesh meos. That was the case at the bottom line of Amud Aleph, where he was told to write in 400, she has to bring in something that will be evaluated at 500. Now, as we said, there are other approaches to how to break down the Mishnah, but for our purposes, this will suffice. As you can see, the Gemara itself doesn't get into the reasons for it. Why is it not sufficient just to open up and leave it at that? The rule that things that are subject to evaluation, the amount to be written in, it should be a fifth less than the amount at which they evaluate things. There are reasons for why each case had to be spelled out, and we alluded to some of these considerations, but very, very briefly, when we made reference to Rashi, how people will inflate the value of things for the purpose of creating a sense of honor. So you could see that consideration, without being told that it's a standard situation, you might have thought that will change depending on who is bringing the item in and how much the item is really worth. That having been said, we understand that there is a uniform rule that applies to all of the cases, as we just saw. The Mishnah. Poska lahachnis loy ksofim. An agreement was made, an understanding was that she will bring in to the marriage cash. Sila, for each sela that she brings in, a sela is 4 dinar, as we mentioned earlier. If she agrees to bring in a sela, nasa shisha dinarim, he'll write into the ksuba 6 dinar. So here you have, in effect, a second example of cash being brought into the marriage. Again, the Gemara will have to deal with the seeming redundancy, as this appears to be a repeat of the beginning of the Mishnah on Amud Aleph. Hechosen mikabelov asora dinrim lekupa lechol mona umona. For every mona, a mona we mentioned before is 100 dinar. For every 100 dinar that she brings into the marriage, the husband agrees to supply 10 dinar. Again, 10 dinar per 100 dinar that she brings into the marriage, lekupa. What is the kupa? So Rashi says that it's for all types of fragrances and cosmetics that women use. The Rashi says this number is a result of the Rabbanan figure that a woman who brings in 100, she brings in a mona, she's deserving of cosmetics and fragrances to the value of 10 dinar, again, per mona. Exactly what frequency is involved here, how often does he have to supply these things, this is something the Gemara will raise as a question and not really provide a final answer. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Hakol Kaminig Hamadina. Reb Shimon Gamliel says that it's all dependent, this issue of how much he is to contribute toward her cosmetics supply is dependent on the minig hamadina, the custom of each place. The Gemara asks the question that we alluded to earlier: Hainu posek kenegdom chamisha asar mana. On Amud Aleph, it was stated that if 1,000 mana is brought in, that is the amount that was stated there was 1,000 dinar. That's 1,000 dinar is brought into the marriage. So he is going to write into the ksuba as if he received 1,500. So is that not the same as what's taught in this Mishnah, where if 1 dinar is brought in, he's going to write in 1.5 dinar. That is, if 1 selah is brought in, he's going to write in 1.5 selah, which is the same as saying shisha dinrim. The Gemara answers, and you'll notice we have a long answer. Tana iska rabba v'tana iska zuta. The word iska is a reference to cash. The Mishnah teaches a large cash amount, and the Mishnah teaches a small cash amount. And that in both cases, the same procedure, that you're going to write in to the ksuba a third more. And I need to have both examples. The itana iska rabba, had we been taught the principle with regard to a large amount of cash brought into the marriage, the nafish revacha, it enables a person to make a large profit. Avul iska zuta, the zuta revacha, a small amount of cash that will only enable a person to profit a small amount. Ema lo, maybe this procedure or this practice of writing a third more doesn't apply. Tzricha, therefore we have to tell you the case of the iska zuta as well. The yashun iska zuta, had we told you about writing in a third more with regard to a small amount brought into the marriage, the zutar ziyuna, the expenses that the husband will have to lay out are limited. When we speak about cash and investing, in order to realize profit, people spend money on advertising and other expenditures before one realizes the profits. So that when it comes to a small amount of money that's brought in, so the entire investment is going to be a rather limited, small matter, where his expenses aren't very great. Aval iska rabba dinafish ziyuna. When it comes to a large amount of cash brought in, which is going to necessitate the husband in making large expenditures before realizing the profits, Amalo, maybe there he's not expected to write in a third more. Tzricha. Therefore, we have to tell you that in the case of Iska Rabba as well, he writes in a third more. Hechosin mekabel of asora dinar lekupa, my kupa. What is meant by kupa? Omar Ravashi, kupa shel besomim. It's a kupa literally is a box we can refer to as her supply of besomim. Now the word besomim can mean, superficially, it can mean fragrances, perfumes. However, we're going to come back to this word in a moment. We continue in the Gemara. V'omar Ravashi, lo nemru dvarim halalu ela b'Yushalayim. This practice that the Mishnah mentions is stated only in Jerusalem. Rashi says, "Hoyunagas liskashi b'samim," was the way of women to adorn themselves with perfumes. There's a Tosfos on this topic that's very elucidating. Taisus lo nemru dvarim halol elo b'Yerushalayim. Looking at the Taisus just across from here a bit up, he says, V'hod amrinu perek torah b'kalfi. In Maseches Yuma it says, Shelo hoyso kalat tzrich lizbasim Yerushalayim. In Jerusalem, the seat of the Beis Hamikdash, brides didn't have to perfume themselves. There was such an intense fragrance that was emitted by the incense offering that there was no need for perfumes. So Tosfos explains, "Vaday l'reach lo hayu tzrichos lizbasim." For aromatic purposes, there was no need for her to adorn herself. Avol tzrichos hayu lekupa shel besamim. There nevertheless was the necessity of a cosmetics supply, and here you notice the word besamim. We're not going to translate it anymore as perfumes, but rather la'adein habosar, ulahashir hasear, ulafashet hakemotim. Other cosmetic functions are to tenderize the flesh, or to la'adein has to do with, it could be an issue of complexion alteration as a result of the use of different cosmetics. A depilatory, to remove hairs, unwanted hairs, and lefashet hakmotim, to smooth out the wrinkles. You can see that some things just never change. We continue in the Gemara. A marking appears. The mivneh heading on the side indicates, the structural note indicates that this double underline is a sidra shel she'elos, a series of questions be'inyan tashlum be'ad hakupa, regarding this payment that the husband is to make toward the cosmetics supply. Boy Ravashi, and we've featured this by the way as a long question. All of this section of Gemara is just a series of questions that end up without any real answer. Boy Ravashi, b'mona anisham o b'mona hamiskabel. It was said that for each 100, he is to provide 10 dinar for the cosmetics. When we say the 100, is it for each 100 that they state in their evaluation, or is it the 100 per 100 that he writes in, which is going to be a fifth less? And if you say it's the amount that he really writes in, Yom Rishon o Kol Yom V'Yom, is it an amount that he pays for the first day of their wedding, for their first day of marriage, or every day? And if you say he has to pay this every day, Shabbos Rishon o Kol Shabbos v'Shabbos, is it for their first week or for every week? And you say he has to pay this every week, Chodesh Rishon o Kol Chodesh v'Chodesh, is it just their first month of marriage or every month? And if you say every month, Shana Rishona o Kol Shana v'Shana, is it just for their first year or for the rest of their lives? Teku, and this remains unresolved. HaRav Yehuda Amarav. Maise bebita shenagdimon ben Gurion. In a case, a story happened with the daughter of Nakdimon ben Gurion. This, by the way, it needs to be contrasted with the story we had in our previous shiur on Daf Samachayom and Aleph of the daughter-in-law of Nakdimon ben Gurion. Here we're dealing with his daughter, and the daughter's husband died, and she is going to draw support from the husband's estate. Sheposku lo chachomim arba meis zehuvim lekupa shel besamim lebo bayom. The chachomim decided that she deserves 400 pieces of gold for her cosmetics supplied for one day. Omro lahem, she said to the Chachomim, Kach tifseku livnoi sechem, you should be zoiche to be able to supply your daughters with an amount like that. V'onu achreo amen, and they responded with an affirmation. The pshat that we gave with regard to the daughter of Nakdimon ben Gurion was based on Rashi's explanation, where Rashi said Shemeis Bailo Basila Beis and Lipsok Lot Socham Minachosov. There's a different approach, and with this different approach and the approach given by Tosfos, we'll be able to appreciate their response a little better. Tosfos at the bottom says V'yanu Achrei Omein L'malo on Daf Samachei with the daughter-in-law story Lo Anu Achrei, and we featured this in our shiur. They didn't answer Omein. Shalohoya Bailo Chai, her husband was not alive. Aval Kan Shohoya Chai. In this case, we're talking about an amount that they determined that the husband has to give her. He is still alive. Onu achra omein. Ubaylo itil al chachomim yifsiku la. The case, according to Tosfos, is that the husband turned to the chomim. Listen, you calculate how much I have to provide for her. So with the Tosfos approach, we understand why the Chachamim were motivated to answer Omein to the bracha, because it was a happy circumstance that the husband was still alive, as opposed to the story on Daf Samachei. They didn't want to answer Omein to what she was saying, because she was in effect describing a situation of her husband having died. As we go on, you notice we now have a second Maisa involving the daughter of Nakdimon ben Gurion. On the side, we have a topic heading, Maisim Bita Shenakdimon ben Gurion Bizman HaChurban. This is a story that takes place at the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Tonu Rabbanon, Maiseh b'Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. It was a story involving Rabbi Yochanan Shohaya Rochev ala Chamor V'Yotzim Yishalayim. He was riding on a donkey, leaving Jerusalem. V'Yotamid of Mahalchan Achrov, and his students were following him. Ra Rivo Achas Shoiso Malaketes Sa'irim Mibein Glole Behemton Shel Arvim. And he saw a girl, Riva is a young girl, who was collecting barley grains from the dung of Arab animals. Kevon Shirasa Oisoi, when she saw him, Nis Atfa Besaira, she wrapped herself in her hair, the Omda Lefonov, and she stood in front of him. Omra Loi. So the girl says to Rabbi Yochanan, Rebbe Parnaseni, give me support, give me food. Omar Lo BT Mi'at, who are you? Omra Lo Bas Nakdimon ben Gurion Ani, I'm the daughter of Nakdimon. Nakdimon, as I'm sure you surmised, was a man of great wealth. And we pointed that out in our previous shiur as well. Omar Lo BT Mamon Shel Beis Avich Heichon Holach. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asks her, the wealth of your father, where did it go? Omra Lo Rebbe. So she says to Rabbi Yochanan, Lo Kedain Maslin Maslo B'Yerushalayim. Is there not the following analogy that is given in Jerusalem? Melach Mamon Choser. Melach literally is salt. Salt is a preservative. If someone wants to preserve his money, wants to cause his wealth to last, the way to do that is choser. Choser means to diminish. That means one is to subtract from his wealth for the purposes of tzedakah. To constantly be involved with giving charity. We'll call it the subtraction, the diminishing of funds is the way to preserve the funds. And I would add on my own, not only to preserve the funds, but to cause an increase in the funds. In the merit of one's giving charity, aser b'shvil shetis asher. give meiser in order to become wealthy. Give a tenth. Tithe your money. Give money tithes for charitable purposes. That's the way, not only to preserve, but to increase. The Amri law, another version, instead of saying choser, that rather melach momon is chesed, doing acts of loving kindness. Rashi adds that based on the continuation of the Gemara later, Gemara will ask on the second line from the bottom, what do you mean? Nakdim Ben-Gurion didn't practice chesed. He didn't practice suck. He certainly did. So the Gemara will eventually answer that he didn't do as much as he was capable of doing. The Gemara goes on. Rabbi Yochanan Zakei asks her, V'shel beis chamich heichanu, and the wealth of your father-in-law, where did that go? Omra lo, she answered, Bozeh v'ibed ezeh. Literally, this one came and caused this one's loss. Rashi says, Lefish nisarev bo. Nisarev would be a guarantor, so that if Nakdim Ben-Gurion lost money, her father-in-law served as his mechutin's guarantor. So whatever losses Nakdimon experienced in his financial losses, he wasn't able to meet his debts. So those debts had to be paid up through the father-in-law. So that caused him to lose. Omro lo, she says to Rabbi Yochanan Zakei, Rabbi, Zachorato keshechosamto al Kesubosi, do you remember when you signed on my Kesuba? Omar lohen letalmidov. He then turns to the Talmidim that were with him. Zochor ani keshechosamti al Kesubosi shelzu. I remember signing on her Kesuba document, Voisikuri ba elef alofim dinore zahav mi beis aviha chutz mishel chamiha. The amounts were vast. Elef alofim means thousands upon thousands of gold dinar coins she brought into the marriage from her father's house, besides the amount that was coming in from her husband's side. Basically, Chamiha literally is from her father-in-law, meaning from her husband's side. Bocho Rabbi Yochanan Zakei v'Omar. Yochanan Zakei cried, and he said, Ashreichem Yisrael, fortunate are you, the Jewish people. When the Jewish people follow the will of the Almighty, Ein kol uma v'loshen sheiletus bohem. No people nor nationality has any rule over them. And when the Jewish people do not fulfill the will of the Almighty, Mosrun biyadu moshvela, the Almighty hands them over to a lowly nation. Biyad umoshvela, not only to a lowly nation, ela biyad behemton shel umoshvela, but to the animals of the lowly nation. And we saw this above when reference was made to her, to this girl, the daughter of Nakdim Ben-Gurion, seeking her meager sustenance from the dung of those animals. Rashi adds, before we described her taking the barley grains from the dung of the Arabs, Aravayim, the Arabians or the Arabs, animal dung. Rashi at the bottom says, Aravim kori uma shvela. They're called a lowly nation. They're mere desert tent dwellers. They don't have any established cities, and as a result of their temporal existence, they're referred to as an umah shvela, the term lowly nation in that sense. The Gemara continues with the question that we mentioned earlier. V'nakdimon ben Gurion lo ovad tzedakah. She said above that her father didn't practice the giving of charity. Is that so? V'hatanya, was it not taught? Omru olav al Nagdimon ben Gurion. It was said regarding him, when he left his house to go study Torah in the Beis Medrash, klimelas hoyu. We continue at the top of Daf Samach Zayin, matziin tachtov. They would place under him, meaning as he was walking along, he was never walking on the pavement itself, on the ground itself, but they would place klimilas, fabrics, soft fabrics under his feet. And as he passed by, the poor would gather up these fabrics, and these fabrics had value to them, and in that way the aniyim were able to support themselves. So you see that Nakdimon did practice charity. So what was meant before, that the daughter would say he didn't practice tzedakah. One approach is l'chodahu di avad. A very, very interesting answer, in that it's all a matter of intent. According to this answer, the Gemara is saying that he didn't have any intent for charitable purposes. He did it for his own honor. It was a sign of he would attract a great amount of public respect by people being in awe of his wealth, that he was able to do such a thing. So since there was no charitable intent, it's considered according to this answer at least, as if it wasn't an act of tzedakah. Another approach is, he may very well have had intent for tzedakah purposes in this practice, but but as much as he could, he didn't. He didn't take upon himself the charitable, or the burden of charity that he would have been, or was able to, could have maintained. Kida Amri, in Shia's people say, Lefum gam lo shichana, according to the size of the camel, is the load you can place upon him. So according to your wealth, if you're a man of great wealth, you should be giving a vast amount of charity. From time to time we hear of famous personalities, famous wealthy individuals giving large charitable contributions, but one has to think about, it's very nice he's giving a large charitable contribution, but is that in proportion to the amount he could really be giving? In other words, we shouldn't be impressed with, we'll say, just objective numbers, objective amounts that are given, but one has to look at the amount that's given relative to the wealth of the individual giving it. Tanya, Omar Rav Ozer Ber Tzaddik, Erev Nechama. This expression is an expression of vowing, of swearing. Erev Nechama imlo reisiha shel oisel melaketes saorin mi base talfe susim be'ako. That's basically, I saw her collecting barley grains from between the hooves of horses in Akko. Akko, a name of a community in Israel. Karasi alel mikrozeh, and Rebbe Ozer says, and upon seeing that, I referred to her the following pasuk: Im lo yisedi loch hayofa banoshim tzii loch bikvei atzon ri es gedio sayach. Al tikri gedio sayach elo gevio sayach. Rashi on the second line from the top: Im lo seidi im lo titni leiv kenes Yisrael lishmor satorah. If you, the Jewish people, don't pay attention to keeping the Torah, to what we would say being an observant Jew, observing, following, keeping the laws of the Torah, and it not merely being what they call a good Jew at heart, or I have good Jewish intentions, but it means fulfillment of the Torah, of the Torah's precepts. If the Jewish people are not involved with that, your end is going to be this, that you're going to be sent out to graze, and the literal reading of the pasuk, you'll follow the steps of your sheep and graze your goats. But the Gemara added, Al tikri gediosech el gaviosech. You'll be grazing your own bodies. And the idea is that in order to preserve your own bodies, you're going to have to go out, like where Ozer had described, you have to go out into the fields following animals to collect grains from between their feet. Of course, our hope in learning Torah and providing these shiurim, the Gemara Markings Project, is designed to inspire people. That's our hope and prayer, that people will gain more from their Torah learning, and Torah learning leads to Torah practice, and Torah learning in and of itself is the single greatest mitzvah that we have to perform, and our hope and prayer is that we should all merit experiencing Torah success and in its learning, and also in the fulfillment of its mitzvahs.